Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Ají wash processed Colombia from A Matter of Concrete. And there's the container right there. And A Matter of Concrete, based out of Rotterdam, Netherlands. And they were a suggestion to us by JZA and Sam Winters, so shout outs to and thank you to both of you for the suggestion. This is A Matter of Concrete's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And even though I'd never tried them before, I had heard a lot about them ever since they first started production. And since then, I've been monitoring their website for the coffees that they've released, as they have offered a number of very interesting coffees over the years. Unfortunately, I never purchased any of them, mostly because the shipping costs were very high. I'm not sure what the shipping costs are now, but I actually did find this coffee when I was out traveling, and I felt like a great opportunity to finally try them out for myself. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, this one is one of their filter roasts, I do believe, but even if it's not, you can tell that this coffee is very light, and I would say that it is on par with some of the coffees that I have had from a lot of other Dutch coffee roasters, which is of course to say Manhattan and Fried Hats. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's as light as some of the really light ones that I've had from them, but even then it is still on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 19, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and there was a surprisingly high level of peachiness in this coffee, and they only have two notes listed on the little container right here, and it's peach, or correction, nectarine and rosehip. And that's one of the things that appealed to me about this coffee, but I was surprised by how clear and pronounced it was, especially in the finish, as there was an abundance of clean, sweet, and well-defined stone fruits with a slight baking spice aspect that reminded me a bit of a spiced peach cobbler with some ever so slight citric tones. As a result, it was a very lovely first impression, and it definitely set the expectations for this one extremely high. We move on to day 22. As we opted for the Chemex, and this one focused a little bit more on the spiced and herbal side of things, as it was a bit reminiscent of hibiscus with a bit more of the peachiness present in a more subtle sense, a slight grainy quality as well, so this one was nowhere near as good as that first impression. But we move on to day 25 as we opted for the April brewer, and it still was not quite as good as that first try, as the focus the last few days has been a bit more on the floral side of things, with a strong red florality, as well as a lingering spice tone that was somewhat reminiscent of spiced cider. In addition to that, the peachiness and nectarine is present, but once again in a significantly more subtle sense, especially relative to that first impression. So it's still nice, just skewing a little bit more in the opposite direction of what I was looking for. We move on to day 28 as we opted for the V60 with A Matter of Concrete recipe that we did find, and that included higher temperatures and a bit more concentrated of a ratio, and the cup does continue to offer something different today, as it's a little better balanced. There's a bit more of a red pink fruit aspect to it in a sharp tropical sense, with a slight, we would describe it as pink dragon fruit or raspberry aspect to the cup. More even and slightly cleaner, as the stone fruit is present yet again, but continues to remain a slight bit softer. We move on to day 31 as we opted for the Chemex with the Matter of Concrete recipe that we found. And the cup was actually the best it had been up to this point, with the peachiness and nectarine coming through a lot more in the finish. It does have this sort of dulce de leche feel to it, with a spiced cinnamon quality as well as a caramelized sweetness, and more of the mentioned florality as well as pink red fruits and berries in the cup. So a lot of nice depth to it as well, and this was definitely one of the more enjoyable days, especially with the first impression that we had. We're starting to see a little bit more of the same theme to it. Day 34, through the Chemex again with A Matter of Concrete's recipe, and it's still pretty nice, though not quite as impressive as the previous day, as it skewed much more on the herbal florality, a bit of brightness, and a bit more of those pink red fruit aspects yet again. So I was noticing a slight bit of inconsistency within this coffee. So on day 37, we opted to go back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was close to being back to the best it had been yet again, as there was better definition to the peachiness with some slight red raspberry, soft lemon, and tropical citrus before finishing into a cinnamon spiced quality. Red florality continues to remain present and pronounced with a little bit of that listed rosehip aspect to the cup. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we will start with the cleanliness level 4. So there isn't anything to necessarily take away from the overall clarity to it. If there's one kind of slight grievance I had, it's that maybe this coffee wasn't always the most well-defined or well-structured throughout. So for that reason, I mean, it's still definitely in that level 4 category, but I just think that especially based off that first impression, it just kind of left me wanting, as there was potential for this one to have maybe slightly higher side of the level 4 credentials to it. Finish, level 4. So it did finish off into a very kind of interesting, as mentioned, spiced quality to it. So cinnamon, that kind of caramelized finish, in addition to that, a lingering herbality. So there's a fair bit within the finish. Once again, that goes to maybe not necessarily a terrific amount of structure to it. It's just a lot of different things, a lot of depth to this one in general. Sweetness, level 4. And at first it was a fair bit of that sort of peachy, and I would say even at times peach pie crust sort of flavor profile to it. Very sweet and sugary in that sense. Though the more I had this coffee, the more I could say that it was skewing a little bit more in that cinnamon spiced quality, and in addition to that, the kind of caramelized quality as well. Nonetheless, definitely a sweeter coffee, especially with the first impression, so level 4 definitely felt fitting for this one. Florality, level 4, given that that's one of the only 2 notes that they do have listed on here, then I don't think it's surprising that it did score as high as it did. There's an abundance of red florals in this one, as there was a notable red theme to this coffee as well. I would say that at times it was maybe the more consistent of the characteristics within this one. Level 4 definitely felt fitting. Rosehip, hibiscus, a lot of those red floral components to it. Stone fruit, level 4. And I understand it was maybe a slight bit generous, though towards the end I could say there was a little bit more of that fresh fruit, stone fruit, the listed nectarine, the listed peachiness that they do have on here. I think that first impression that I had of this coffee just definitely gave it the expectation that it was going to be a super peachy coffee throughout, and I really struggled to replicate that first experience. So level 4, maybe generous, but this coffee definitely has very high peach potential to it. Let's go through the level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3, and that might be one of the more surprising parts of this coffee, as it wasn't necessarily the brightest. I do have to say that it probably fluctuated a little bit between that 3 and 4 mark, but I'm not entirely sure that this one was ever intended to be an overly bright coffee. Grapefruit level 3, once again, I'm not entirely sure that they were ever going for a red themed sort of fruit component to it, but I was definitely picking up a fair bit of red raspberries, as well as that red citrus quality, which is where the citric level 3 comes from. I did kind of mention that there's that dragon fruit, which I think would go a little bit more on the berry fruit side of things, but there was also a little bit more of a slight, we'll just say, citric quality in a more tropical sense to it as well. That did give it, once again, more depth, and that's why that scored there at that level 3 mark as well. Caramel level 3, and I mentioned that there's that spiced cinnamon quality as well as that caramelized quality that's also present within the finish. So that one scored at the level 3. I do have a fun quick anecdote about this tasting wheel. I actually made it on the second to final day with the Chemex, and then I made it again with the V60 3 days later, and it's because I didn't realize that I'd already made the tasting wheel, and when I looked at the tasting wheels, they were the exact same, and I said that's actually kind of funny. So this coffee, at least in terms of the way that I charted it, was very similar on 2 different days, so that does speak slightly to its consistency, as I could say that maybe the reason I'm not saying it's overly consistent is because there are certain days where certain aspects were a little bit more pronounced and defined, and on other days, other ones were. Nonetheless, I would say the flavor profile and theme was pretty consistent otherwise. But as I am looking at this tasting wheel, given that I've made it twice, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I did like it. I don't want that to be lost in the overall review of it, mostly because I had such high expectations for it based off that first cup, and I said, whoa, this might be my favorite wash processed Colombian coffee that we've reviewed this entire year. But it was maybe my own fault or maybe my own struggles to continue to replicate that same sort of experience. But it was my job to tinker with this coffee, and I think what doesn't help either is that these containers are so small. So it's 100 grams of coffee, so I'm brewing 13-gram doses, and I only got 6-7 cups out of it. So for that reason, I feel like if I had much more to work with, then there may have been much more I could have gotten out of this this coffee. Maybe I could have figured it out. Maybe I could have gotten a little bit more consistency, but working with 100 grams is never ideal, as by the end of this, I feel like I didn't necessarily get this coffee right and to the level I was hoping for. That first impression though, truly a very high bar setter for it that I was unfortunately never able to replicate from that point going forward. Nonetheless, very nice coffee. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to if you do enjoy those two aspects. I should say those three aspects specifically. So the stone fruit qualities, especially in a more fresh fruit sense, the floral components, especially in more of that red floral sense, and then kind of caramelized cinnamon spice-like quality to it. I feel like those three things going together were the most abundant characteristics within this coffee. Great clarity still, great sweetness, maybe not necessarily the most amount of brightness or body, but if those are the things that you're prioritizing and looking for, then I feel like this one's a very good fit, and I feel like you could get some wonderful things out of this one, but it's also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Ají wash processed Colombia from A Matter of Concrete. Thank you for watching.